Herzlich willkommen im Museum Judengasse zu der ersten digitalen Veranstaltung, die wir durchführen. Und es ist mir eine große Freude, dass ich als Gast Delphine Horvilleur gewinnen konnte. Sie ist eine von insgesamt 4 Rabbinerinnen in Frankreich und die bekannteste Repräsentantin des liberalen Judentums. Sie ist aber nicht nur in jüdischen Kreisen ein bekanntes Gesicht. Als ausgebildete Journalistin schreibt sie regelmäßig für französische Zeitungen, hat mehrere Bücher verfasst, ist Chefredakteurin des Magazins Noir und zierte Anfang des Jahres sogar das Cover der Zeitschrift Elle. Eigentlich wollte sie heute Abend persönlich nach Frankfurt kommen, um hier ihr erstes ins Deutsche übersetzte Buch vorzustellen. Die derzeitige Corona-Krise hat uns nun dazu gezwungen, die Veranstaltung ins Internet zu verlegen. Und ich freue mich, dass Sie uns jetzt folgen werden und dem zuhören. Ich bin Mirjam Wenzel, ich bin die Direktorin des Jüdischen Museums, verfolge seit langem die Aktivitäten von Delphine Horvilleur und bin nun gespannt auf unser Gespräch über ihr erstes ins Deutsche übertragene Buch, Überlegungen zur Frage des Antisemitismus. Chère Madame le Rabbin, dear Mrs. Horvilleur, bonjour. It's a real pleasure to have the opportunity to talking with you tonight. Thank you for enabling this talk under the given circumstances. You are the most known figure and face of liberal Judaism in France. I'm wondering, how big is the liberal movement within the French Jewish community, and since when does it exist, and does it have any connections with the liberal Jewish movement in Germany?
Well, first of all, thank you so much for this invitation. I was truly looking forward to coming to you physically, but it's not possible today. But I hope it's just postponed, and it's a pleasure to be with you today, even through this screen. Liberal Judaism in France developed over the last century. It's still probably a minority sensibility in France, but it's growing undoubtedly in recent years. More and more people feel connected to progressive voices and progressive forms of Jewish sensibilities. I'm connected to European voices of liberal Judaism, but not as much as I would like to, I have to say today. I keep thinking, especially in this time of crisis, of how dear it is to us to be connected. I think we all are aware that distances don't mean anything today, that we feel sometimes very close to people on the other side of the world, when we feel very far from people who live on the other side of the street in this time of confinement. And I feel that maybe more than ever, European links can mean something. You know, we are in a time of, we talk a lot about contamination and the fact that frontiers do not really protect us. But I think we really need to be aware that ideas can disseminate and in a way contaminate much faster than any virus, and we truly need to be more and more connected to each other, to feel how much we share our vulnerability, but it also means we share a lot of strength. So I hope I'll be more connected to Germany in the coming years.
It'd be wonderful, I think. You are editor-in-chief of the magazine Noir, which is, as the name indicates, more than a magazine. What is the idea and what are the activities around Noir?
So Noir is a trimestral magazine, but indeed it's more, we call it a lab of Jewish thought. We try to be involved in Jewish thought, but also in a dialogue with art and culture and sometimes psychoanalysis and history and science. And we try to think how those different fields of expertise could engage in a fruitful dialogue with Judaism. So we organize what we call a Bet Midrash, a house of study, until the crisis, we had a monthly meeting in a very interesting place in Paris, in a movie theater. Hundreds of people were meeting to study Talmud and Jewish texts. And now we switched to virtual mode. So we meet every week, actually on Tuesday night. Thousands of people are now joining us every Tuesday night to study in a kind of informal Bet Midrash for the past weeks. And I think we will now continue in this mode. And it gives us an opportunity to engage in a dialogue that is between people of really different backgrounds. Sometimes people who speak Hebrew or don't speak Hebrew, read the text or do not, or never read a text. Jews and non-Jews are meeting somehow through the power of Jewish literature to engage in a kind of more universal discussion.
Reflections on the question of anti-Semitism is your first book that was translated into German. It is also your first book that is not dedicated to a particular aspect of Jewish tradition, but to violence and hate that are part of Jewish history. Anti-Semitism is on the rise all over Europe, but particularly violent in France today. Was there an initial moment when you felt that you want to write a book about this topic?
You know, it's an interesting question. I could obviously point moments in history that have been turning points for all Jews, all European Jews, and definitely for French Jews. I could point in my personal history moments like 1990. I don't know if people in Germany remember, there was a desecration of a cemetery in the south of France, in Carpentras in 1990. And I think for my generation, it was a turning point because I feel we grew up in a narrative that was quite obvious for most of us, a narrative that said that we were somehow protected from this anti-Semitic violence because the Shoah was very close in history and we were in a way lucky to be born afterwards and to experience this time of appeased moments of anti-Semitism. And for me, 1990 was a kind of turning point where I was at the time a teenager and I realized that actually my generation would probably also have to deal with this terrible phenomenon. But then there were obviously other moments in recent years. I could point the kidnapping and assassination of Ilan Halimi in 2006, and the assassination of children in school in Toulouse in 2012. Those were really very traumatic events. I mean, I can't even imagine worst tragedies in recent years, children assassinated in front of their school in France, year 2012. You know, until now, I have a hard time even imagining why millions of people were not in the streets on the following day. You know, there's a kind of really, for me, it strikes me as a reflection of what kind of paralysis, emotional or political paralysis, enabled this manifestation not to take place. You see what I mean? So there were those turning points in history of obviously the Hypercacher attack and others. But at the same time, I have to say that as someone who is interested in Jewish thoughts, and indeed all my other books, as you said, deal with rabbinic literature, I think the moment you get interested into Jewish thought and Jewish history, there is no way you can avoid the question of that hate. You know, you need to ask yourself, why did it happen again and again all along history, almost with no interruption or very short interruptions in time? Why does it come back? And therefore to ask also what the Jewish texts have to say about it. And this was the starting point of my book about anti-Semitism. I started to wonder if there was a kind of Jewish wisdom in the approach to this phenomenon. Not that the rabbis or Jewish texts have any answers or know exactly what triggers anti-Semitism and how you can fight it. But they have no control over the phenomenon, obviously, except in the mind of anti-Semites. The Jews don't have any control over that hate. But I think there is a very powerful analysis of conditions in the society that enable this hate to grow. I think somehow Jewish texts and rabbinic minds have many things to teach us about the conditions in someone's mind or in a specific society, in a collective moment, something that enables anti-Semitism to grow. And this is what I try to analyze in my book.
And this is what distinguishes your book from other elaborations on anti-Semitism, I think. And I would like to start with that, with your reading of biblical and rabbinical texts now. Before we start, I would like to give you a short insight into the way how Delphine Horvilleur is writing. And my colleague, Sarah Fischer, will read some passages from the first chapter, which is called The Jewish Non-Identity, introducing us to Avraham and his story.
Die jüdische Nicht-Identität. Wo finden sich Anhaltspunkte für einen aufkeimenden antisemitischen Hass in den Texten der jüdischen Tradition? In der Tora, von den Christen Altes Testament genannt, werden keine Ressentiments gegen die Juden erwähnt, und zwar aus dem einfachen Grund, weil Juden gar nicht erwähnt werden. Das Volk, von dem die Tora erzählt, nennt sich zu diesem Zeitpunkt hebräisches Volk oder Kinder Israels. Später in der Geschichte sollten sich die Juden auf genau diese beiden Identitäten berufen. Analysieren wir kurz vorab die Begrifflichkeiten dieser jüdischen Proto-Identität. Der allererste Hebräer namens Abraham wird in der Stadt Ur geboren, im Land der Chaldäer. Er kommt demnach nicht als Hebräer in seinem Ursprungsland zur Welt, sondern erwirbt sich diese Identität erst, als er der Aufforderung Gottes folgt, das Land seines Vaters und seinen Geburtsort zu verlassen. Genesis 12,1: Der Herr sprach zu Abraham: Geh fort aus deinem Land, aus deiner Verwandtschaft und aus deinem Vaterhaus in das Land, das ich dir zeigen werde. Er durchquert einen Fluss, der ihm die Richtung in ein gelobtes Land weist, dessen Namen Kanaan er noch nicht kennt. In der Sprache der Bibel ist der Hebräer, Ivri, wörtlich derjenige, der überquert, der Überquerende. Weil er die Welt seiner Kindheit und seiner Herkunft verlassen hat, nimmt Abraham einen Namen an, der sich auf sein Handeln bezieht, den Namen der Überquerung. Die hebräische Identität, die sich mit ihm ausbildet, ist folglich mit dem Losreißen aus dem Land der Geburt verknüpft. Sie hat keine eigene Herkunft, keinen Anfang. Ein Ägypter kommt aus Ägypten und ein Grieche aus Griechenland. Ein Hebräer aber hat kein namensgebendes Ursprungsland. Sein Name verweist nicht auf die Herkunft, sondern auf den Bruch mit der Herkunft. So entsteht eine subtile Zweideutigkeit in der Definition der hebräischen und später jüdischen Identität. Der Hebräer ist nicht derjenige, der einem Ort entstammt, sondern derjenige, der seinen Geburtsort hinter sich lässt. Sein Name bezeichnet eine geografische oder geistige Abkoppelung. Odysseus stammt aus Ithaka und sehnt sich nach Heimkehr. Abraham hingegen stammt aus Ur und unternimmt alles in seiner Macht Stehende, um nie wieder zurückzukehren. Die hebräische Identität interpretiert also ihren Ursprung im Aufgeben dieser Identität. Sprich, sie entwickelt ihre Identität aus der Nicht-Identität mit ihrem Herkunftsort. Das gelobte Land ist das Begehren eines Landes, in dem wir nicht geboren worden sind. Ein Bestimmungsort, der niemals Rückkehr zum Ursprung oder zum Gleichen ist. Am Anfang steht der Bruch. Diese Idee ist der unmöglichen Definition des Judentums zentral. Besonders treffend spiegelt sie sich in der Formulierung, mit der Jacques Derrida sein Selbstverständnis des Judentums umschreibt. Jude wäre ein anderer Name für die Unmöglichkeit, ein Selbst zu sein. Lange nach Abrahams Auswanderung aus Mesopotamien wird das hebräische Volk das abrahamitische Losreißen mit dem kollektiven Auszug aus Ägypten nachspielen, einem Schlüsselmoment der jüdischen Geschichte.
What is unique about the fact that God is telling Abraham to leave his birthplace in order to become the founding father of a new tribe?
Well, to understand this specificity, we need to listen, I think, to the ongoing discussion and narrative around identity that we are going through all around the world. It's kind of an international phenomenon. People in recent years have been obsessed with what identity means. And generally, they translate identity as being an absolute equality or an absolute belonging and identity between what you are and what your history made of you, like what your parents were and your grandparents were, as if your identity had to do with the place where you are born and with your origin. Like you need to be faithful to this origin to be faithful to your true and authentic identity. And what the story of Abraham teaches you is actually that the opposite is true. Abraham is a founding figure, not because he comes from somewhere, but because he left that place. He hears this call, which tells him, you were born in such a place, this is your father's land, but now leave that place and go to a place that I will show you. And the name of the destination is not even mentioned. It's not about where you go. It's not about where you come from. It's about your ability to do something out of the place where you were born, which means that you are, in the Bible, what you are because you stopped being what you were. You are what you are because you left the place where you were. And I think it's a very powerful way to look at identity and maybe to extract us from this deathful, I think, very bad place where we stand today when people are obsessed with being what they have always been. I think it's a very powerful thing to think about, that actually what makes you who you are, it's your ability to make something of what was given to you, to bring it to another place. And you know what? I think it's particularly powerful to think about it in a time of crisis, such as the sanitary crisis we're going through, or the economic or social political crisis we're going through, because many people are wondering what the world will be like. And they wonder, what could mean getting rid of an old world and entering a new one. And I think it's actually very appeasing and meaningful and fruitful if we're able to consider that our identity has to do not only with the world as it was, but what we can do out of the world that was to create something new that will from now on define us. And this is what the Hebrew calls the Ebru identity. Hebrew in Hebrew means the ability to cross, the ability to become. And it keeps being repeated in so many narratives. Abraham leaves the Chaldean region. The Israelites will leave Egypt, which is considered to be a kind of matrix or a womb for their birth. And we keep telling our story. We say that we are in the image of a God whose name is Heye, and it means in Hebrew, I will be. So we are in the image of a divine whose name is I will be. So the future defines who we are, often much more than our past. It might be surprising, but I think it can be a powerful lesson for all of us.
Throughout your book, and this is where you refer pretty much to Jacques Derrida, the term of Jewish non-identity plays an initial role. And I'm wondering, what is the bone of contention in Jewish non-identity for Gentiles?
This probably won't surprise the people who listen to us. Along history, there has been an impossibility to define what it means to be a Jew. Like if you ask two Jews, there are very famous jokes about it. If you ask two Jews what it means to be a Jew, you'll probably get at least 4, 5, 6, 10 answers. And if you ask me, or even ask yourself what it means to be a Jew, the answer you will give today is probably not the answer you gave yesterday or the answer you'll give tomorrow. Because for some people, Judaism or Jewishness has to do with the ability to remember. For some other people, it's about tikkun olam, their engagement, their political or socio-political engagement in the world. For other people, it's a relationship to Israel or to the Hebrew language or to practicing Judaism, specific holidays, or even the ability to cook, in a specific way, to use old recipes of your grandma's, or sometimes it's about the ability to tell jokes and to use Jewish humor. And none of this definition is right and none of this definition is wrong. Jews along history And that's both their vulnerability and their strength, I think, have an incapacity to tell what does their identity rely upon. You know, we have no idea, but it creates a constant, a kind of constant break. This is what Jacques Derrida tries to define when he says that his Jewish identity relies on the fact that there's a constant different or a shift or kind of break between him and himself. And I think, I mean, it talks to me, but I think it talks to many Jews along history, that Judaism has to do with the fact that you both belong and not belong. You belong to the group, but you're never completely part of a group. There's always the kind of a shift and brokenness inside yourself, which enable actually Judaism to go on, because, you know, Jews went through many civilizations. Most of them, ancient civilizations, disappeared. You know, the Greeks had an influence, all Greece had an influence on our culture, the way Persian culture influenced us. But today, you know, the antique Greek culture and old Persian culture somehow disappeared, but the Jews are still in the landscape, because I think in a way it may sound paradoxical, but their identity was saved by the fact that it was never defined. What it means to be a Jew will be defined by the next Jew. I mean, my children and my grandchildren will probably have new definition. And the fact that we never said our last word about what it means to be who we are enable a kind of eternal recreation of meaning around our identity. And it has a lot to do with the question of anti-Semitism, I think. At least that's part of my theories in the book. I believe that this ongoing impossibility to define what Judaism is about has a lot to do with the hate, with the anti-Semitic hate. You know, it's pretty annoying when you're facing someone or a group that keeps telling you, I haven't said my last word about what I am and what I could be. So I think that's a kind of bone of contention that we keep exploring.
There is one book, namely the Book of Esther, or the Esther Scroll, which plays a crucial role in the definition of what is Jewish collective identity and what is anti-Semitism. And I would like to invite my colleague to read a passage from the chapter that is devoted to that book.
Irgendwo im persischen Exil entsteht also die jüdische Identität, so wie wir sie heute als die einer Religionsgemeinschaft oder eines versprengten Volkes verstehen. Das Judentum ist in der Bibel die Folge des Exils, das Los derer, die ihrem Ursprungsland entrissen worden sind. Mit Esther bekommt Achasveros Hof eine Königin, über die der König nichts weiß. Doch kaum hat der Jude, hier in der Frauengestalt Esther, den Palast betreten, taucht in der Erzählung ein anderes, für die Handlung ebenso wesentliches Element auf: ihr Gegenspieler. Der Bösewicht im Buch Esther heißt Haman, Sohn Hamedatas, der unter Achasveros zum höchsten Regierungsbeamten aufgestiegen ist. Damit hat auch der Hass Einzug gehalten. Aus einem undurchsichtigen Grund, über den die Exegeten diverse Mutmaßungen anstellen, ist Mordechai Haman ein Dorn im Auge. Eifersucht, eine Abrechnung? Wie dem auch sei, Haman hasst ihn so, dass er die Vernichtung seines ganzen Volkes anzettelt und sich von Achasveros die Ausführung dieses Völkermords übertragen lässt. Der abscheuliche Haman erwirkt eine Privataudienz bei seinem König und erklärt in Esther 3,8: Es gibt ein Volk, das lebt verstreut und abgesondert unter allen Völkern in allen Provinzen deines Königreichs. Und ihre Gesetze sind anders als die aller Völker. Und sie befolgen nicht die Gesetze des Königs, so dass es dem König nicht geziemt, sie gewähren zu lassen. In anderen Worten, für den König ist es nicht das Gleiche, wenn sie bleiben. In einem einzigen Vers bietet Haman dem Leser eine perfekte Zusammenfassung, eine zeitlose Illustrierung der im Verlauf der Geschichte gegen die Juden erhobenen Anklagen. Ein Volk, zugleich verstreut und abgesondert, das mitten unter den anderen lebt, ohne sich mit ihnen vermischen zu wollen, das weder genau zu unterscheiden noch integrierbar ist. Ihr Partikularismus wird als Bedrohung für die Integrität der Nation oder die politische Macht empfunden, da sie die rigorose Gleichheit zwischen den Elementen einer unterschiedslosen Nation gefährden. Künftig lastet auf ihnen der Verdacht mangelnder Ergebenheit, der auf lange Sicht die Vertreibung oder physische Vernichtung der Juden rechtfertigt. Just in dem Moment, als der erste Jude in der Bibel erscheint, tritt auch ein irritierender literarischer Zwilling als Gegenspieler auf den Plan. Das Duo Mordechai-Haman scheint von Beginn an die folgende Gesetzmäßigkeit zu besiegeln. Da, wo ein Jude ist, ist auch der Antisemit nicht weit.
You read the Esther Scroll as both a formative story of Jewish collective identity and a precise definition of anti-Semitism personalized by the antagonist of the beautiful Esther and her uncle Mordechai, namely the king's convisé Haman. The Esther Scroll is not a particularly religious text, since the name of God is not even mentioned once. So what is the status of the Esther Scroll in the Hebrew Bible, and why do you think such a religious text has a formative role for Jewish collective identity until today?
Well, the Esther Scroll, many people are not aware of that, but this is the place in the Bible where the word Jew appear, in Hebrew Yehudi. Until the Esther Scroll, each time the word Yehudi, Jew, appeared, it defined a location, like the Judean region or children of a character called Judah in one of Jacob's sons in the Bible. But suddenly in the book of Esther, there is a switch, and Yehudi becomes the name of a collective that has nothing to do with the geographical origin or affiliation of Judah. But suddenly it's about another type of identity, which is totally linked to exile. It's a book of exile, the book of Esther. We suddenly have to deal with exile and deal with our vulnerability as a people, lacking power and lacking political structure. And it actually reflects pretty well what has been the extreme vulnerability of Jews all along history. This need to be in exile to find protection from powerful actors around you has been a constant of Jewish history. You're right to say that the book of Esther is very different from other books in the Bible, from the very fact that the name of God doesn't appear in the book. So it's interesting because it's considered a religious book, but God doesn't interfere. Many even Jewish commentators consider that in the book of Esther, there is what they call an eclipse of the divine. One of the meaning of Esther in Hebrew, Esther Panim, is the disappearance of the face of God. This is how the rabbis interpret the name Esther and the book of Esther. It's as if God was suddenly not in the picture. He withdrew and he let human power and human action take the lead. It's pretty interesting because, you know, the Bible is built of very contradictory voices. Like in the Bible, you can hear the voices of a God that interferes in history, the voices of a God that opens the sea and frees slave and strikes Egypt. But you can also hear other voices. For example, in the book of Job, you hear the voice of a God that let bad things happen to good people. You know, a God that doesn't punish mean people, but acknowledges that sometimes bad things happen to good people. That's the story of Job. And then you have the book of Esther, and the book of Esther presents a totally different theology. It's a theology of God's withdrawal from the world, which places us in an absolute position of responsibility. Humans are in charge, for better and for worse. And not only human, but, and it's quite, I think, meaningful in this text, women, not only generally people, but women are suddenly playing a role. So it tells you actually that sometimes in history, the absolute figures of vulnerability are playing the critical role and can change their future. So it links the destiny of Jews and of women in a very specific way. The fact that both have been along history kind of actors in the background that had no real power but still could change history. And the Book of Esther is a book about anti-Semitism. Obviously, the Jews don't use that term. It's a problematic term. Anti-Semitism, it's a word that has been invented by anti-Semites. So I'm not even sure we should use that word anti-Semite. It's a kind of convention. Everybody knows what we're talking about when you use that term. But the rabbis use the term hate of Israel. Hate of the people of Israel. And it's the epitome, the Book of Esther, of how it's played out in history. Suddenly there's a guy called Haman, which shows up and actually is jealous. He has in himself a kind of envy. He would like to be in power. He would like to be recognized, but he's somehow convinced that what prevents him from being realized in his life, what prevents him from being himself and finding success, is the presence of a small group of people, the Jews, which represents like kind of your own failure. Instead of recognizing your own failure, you project it onto a people. The Jews, along history, as often has been our terrible, task, or I don't know, and it's projected onto us. But actually, it says much more about the mentality of the anti-Semite than it says anything about the Jews, And this is where the character of Haman is very critical. It has a lot to teach us about anti-Semitic narratives along history. And this is what the rabbis recognize.
Yeah, I think that is really striking. I mean, that Haman's anti-Semitic perception is that Jews are the people who are dwelling among the nations, following their own rules, instead the law of the king. And this has a striking similarity with like the prejudices against Jews by the main proponents of enlightenment, such as Voltaire, Kant, and Fichte. It was exactly the same idea. So I was wondering, do you think this perception that Jews are following their own laws and not the law of the king or the law of the state is still relevant today?
I think it has been relevant all along history. The idea that Jews are perceived as being both just like everyone else, but not exactly like everyone else. We accuse them of behaving differently. Like, look at these people who dress differently, who eat differently, who don't want to get married with our daughters. It's like we accuse them of this kind of separatism, but at the same time, we hate them even more when they're just like us and we cannot recognize exactly who is a Jew and who is not. You always hear this rhetoric, and it's still in place today. People wonder, maybe my physician is Jewish and I don't know. Maybe my president has Jewish family and we don't know about it. Maybe my neighbor is a Jew and he never told me. This kind of suspicion of the same and the other being kind of, together in the Jewish identity. We can't stand the fact that the Jew is both different and the same. It's another, but is strangely just like me. And it has a lot to do with this specific hate, which in fact is, and I also develop it in the book, it's quite different from simple racism, in many ways. For another reason also, racism is very often about hating the other because I perceive him as being below me. A racist will say the other is not as educated, as civilized as I am. He's below my level. Whereas a very common phenomenon in anti-Semitism is that we accuse the Jews of not being below, but being above. Like, how is it that the Jews have more luck? They have more money, they have more blessing, they're more successful. Why do they have better apartments or more money or whatever? It's as if the Jew was accused of stealing a higher place in the social hierarchy. He's standing where I should be, somehow he stole my place. What should be my role, my place, in society. So in a way, it's the same as racism, but it's almost the opposite picture of racism. It's like a kind of inferiority complex that you find very often in anti-Semitic rhetoric that has a lot to do with envy, with jealousy, exactly what the character of Haman represents in the book. Suddenly the Jew enables you to find a perfect and global explanation of your own unsuccessful path. You know, if you think you should have been somewhere else and you didn't succeed to be there, it's always easier to consider that someone stole your possibility to stand where you should have been.
I would like to come to another aspect in your book, which is really a dominant and challenging and new, as I find, and that's the whole gender issue, and that starts with your reading of the Talmud, of the rabbinical sources, and you're referring to different stories in the Talmud that are portraying men as female servants, and are discussing circumcision in this context as well. Could you please explain this connection?
Yes. Well, the Talmud is edited and mainly develops in the first centuries of our era. At the time, the rabbis are under Roman domination. So the official authority, political authority and power belongs to the Roman. And so therefore, you very often find in the Talmud an opposition between a kind of absolute virile model of virility incarnated by the Roman, emperor or gladiator or fighter, versus another type of masculinity, a Jewish masculinity that doesn't play at all with the code of what we call in French the alpha male, like the alpha male of the uber men, in a way that the Roman incarnates. The rabbis suddenly identify with another model of masculine power that is somehow very close to feminine attributes of being. What are feminine attributes of being? They don't only belong to women. Sometimes men can have those feminine attributes of being and have to do with the lack of power, but the development of other sources of power, like the power of language, of interpretation, the power of dealing differently with history. This is what, in a way, links the fate of women politically and the fate of Jews. They had to gain power differently because they were not given any political power. They didn't belong to the official hierarchy, so they developed other tools of being and acting in the world. And it's pretty interesting to see that the rabbis in the Talmud are aware of that. But it seems that the anti-Semites along history were somehow, probably unconsciously, also aware of that. Because if you pay attention to anti-Semitic rhetoric along history, and it has been true almost in all times, Jews and women were accused of same things. They were all along history accused of being hysterical, not reliable, loving money, loving to be close to powerful people and the powerful actors of society. They were accused of being lascive. In Middle Age, the sorceresses, witches were accused of poisoning wells, and the Jews were accused of the same thing, which is actually quite interesting to know today, because in what we're experiencing today, in the sanitary crisis we're experiencing, I have no doubt that this type of anti-Semitic rhetoric will be brought back. You will always find people in time of sanitary crisis to accuse somehow the Jews or the Jewish power to be responsible or guilty of a form of contamination or another. So this proximity between what the women have been accused of and what Jews have been accused of really interested me, and I tried to look for Jewish sources, and actually it was very easy to find Jewish sources. We could even talk again about Esther and the book of Esther. It's the same story. The Jew in the biblical book that deals with anti-Semitism, the hero is a Jewess. So it's a woman, because the question of women and Jews are have always been linked, and the rabbi seems to be aware of that. And you're right, I think circumcision plays a role in this question, because circumcision has been perceived as something that Jews all along history cared about, even when they didn't remember anything in their practice, didn't practice in any way. Circumcision remained as a kind of really powerful way to identify in Judaism. And I think for many, and mainly for anti-Semites, it brings back, it relinks the relation between the lack of virility and Jewish identity.
At the end of your elaboration on rabbinical sources and the Talmud, you are quoting Sigmund Freud. Der Kastrationskomplex ist die tiefste unbewusste Wurzel des Antisemitismus. What is the relation between Freud's analysis of a young man's phobias and Talmudic wisdom?
Well, there are many theses and books written about the influence of Talmudic writing and rabbinic thoughts on psychoanalysis, but I will not get into that now. I think what I try to demonstrate in the book is the fact that anti-Semitism has very often to do psychologically with a fear of brokenness in your world. Like, if you're not able to deal with loss, brokenness, fear of the incomplete vision of yourself or of your identity, if you fear you're losing a kind of integrity, very clear frontiers of your world, of your territory, of your mind, of your body, of your identity, you can be pretty sure that very soon you're going to start perceiving Jews as being the agent that prevents you from being yourself. Like a fear of brokenness and incomplete definition has a lot to do with anti-Semitic rhetorics, actually. You know, we always accuse the Jews, and I could give you many examples, even recent ones. You know, I think about what happened in Pittsburgh about a year and a half ago, when the killer entered the synagogue to assassinate worshippers, and they tried to understand why he wanted to kill Jews. He said that Jews were about to bring into the United States caravans of migrants that will contaminate the country. You know, the idea that the Jew is creating a break in the frontier, the territorial frontier or the mental, psychic frontier, is a common feature in anti-Semitism. And actually, this is what psychoanalysis would call a fear of castration. You know, the idea that you might lose something of your integrity. And I think Freud was really aware that the fear of losing and of brokenness has a lot to do with this pathology we call anti-Semitism. What interests me particularly from a rabbinic point of view is the fact that Jewish rites and many Jewish holidays and practices have a lot to do with the recognition of brokenness and inherent brokenness to the human condition, not simply to the Jewish condition, but they constantly teach that you need to be able to live with brokenness. You know, I could give you the example of a Jewish wedding. You know, how do we start a Jewish wedding? By breaking a glass. You cannot imagine building a house without this awareness of brokenness. We start, you know, when a child is born, we do a circumcision. When we start the Seder, or we start every meal, we break a matzah or we break a piece of bread. It's about awareness of how much loss and brokenness is part of life experience. And, you know, I always have in mind the fact that Levinas used to say that Judaism is a religion of adults. And I think it was true. You know, Judaism cares to teach that being an adult means that you have to be able to live with loss and with mourning and with complete visions of yourself and your history. And in a way, you know, it all brings us back to the rise of anti-Semitism in our society today. I think around us, there are many people who are not willing to live with uncertainty, brokenness, and failure, and therefore it says something about the rise in their anti-Semitic rhetorics.
In your elaboration on rabbinical sources, reflection on gender troubles and the question of sexes plays a crucial role, and I would like to invite my colleague Sarah Fisher now to read a passage from your chapter called Anti-Semitism as War of the Sexes.
Antisemitismus als Krieg der Geschlechter. Beginnen wir mit einem Druckfehler, den eines Tages ein Leser in einem Buch entdeckt. Der Leser ist Jacques Derrida. Das betreffende Buch stammt von Jean-Paul Sartre und heißt Überlegungen zur Judenfrage. In der Einleitung zu Sartres Essay liest Derrida: Der Jude ist ein Mensch, den die anderen Menschen für einen Juden halten. Das ist die einfache Wahrheit, von der man ausgehen muss. Und er kommentiert: Meine Ausgabe enthält einen seltsamen Druckfehler. Man liest dort eine Mensch. Der Jude ist eine Mensch. So liefert ein einfacher Tippfehler das Argument dafür, dass der Jude im Laufe der Geschichte häufig als verweiblichter Mann wahrgenommen wurde oder zumindest ein Beweis für das auf der Welt einwirkende Weibliche gewesen sei. 2015 erklärt Roland Dumas, der ehemalige Präsident des französischen Verfassungsgerichts, in Bezug auf den damaligen Premierminister Manuel Valls, dessen Ehefrau Jüdin ist, dieser stehe unter jüdischem Einfluss. Altbekanntes antisemitisches Gedankengut. Die Juderei verführt die Macht, um sie zu manipulieren, verjudet sie, um sie besser unterjochen zu können. Die Schwäche des Mannes erklärt sich schnell, nämlich aus der hinter oder in ihm verborgenen jüdischen Frau. Demnach sei das Verhältnis der Juden zur politischen Macht immer auch ein weibliches Vorhaben. Als Léon Blum in den 1930er Jahren zum französischen Premierminister gewählt wurde, liest man etwa bei einem gewissen Jean-Pierre Maxence, Léon Blum sei eine gelehrte Frau, die vor ihrem faszinierten Salon glänzt. Sehen Sie sich ihn nur genau an im Eifer einer Kundgebung. Das Weibchen, das abwechselnd um ein Männchen scharwenzelt, es beschnuppert und unschmeichelt oder klagend bedroht. Für Léon Daudet ist er das Mädchen oder die Mamsell, die die Wutausbrüche und Zuckungen einer Frau habe. Für Charles Morin schließlich die mit der Gartenschere getaufte Blume Blum, während die Action Française ihn als große Hysterikerin bezeichnet und l'Humanité als große Kokette.
So, what is the relation between the demand for masculinity, authoritarian thinking, and anti-Semitism? And I think this is a relation that is very relevant today.
In my book, I quoted a lot from a book of Sartre, not the one you imagine, not the one about the Jewish identity, the Jewish question, but there is a short novel by Jean-Paul Sartre called in French L'enfance d'un chef, which imagines the youth of an authoritarian figure. I mean, what does it take for a man to become an authoritarian leader? And the whole theory of this novel, this short novel of Sartre has to do with gender questions and the fact that the character is always obsessed since his childhood, is terrified at the idea of lacking virility, of being perceived as a woman or a feminine figure. And when he finally officially acknowledges he's an anti-Semite, and it's like it grounds his identity. He says at a certain point, from now on, I will say I am an anti-Semite, as if it was like the bone foundation of his identity. And at the same time, he says, and I decide two important things. I will grow a bear and I will get married to a virgin woman. You know, and I think this novel of Sartre is quite powerful. Actually, it links in a very powerful way the path toward anti-Semitism that threatens so many people and threatened so many people along history, and the idea that you live with the fear of lack of ownership and control over your life, over your house, over your land, over, your ideas. This, again, we come back to what we just discussed before, the fear of lacking control or being threatened by decomposition or castration has been a constant feature in many authoritarian leaders that very often flirted with anti-Semitism. That's why we need really to pay attention today when we hear sometimes very virile rhetorics of leadership around us, which are often at stake, or we hear them very loud in times of crisis or popularism, when popularism is on the rise. And suddenly people think that a very virile and male rhetoric of a leader will protect them, but actually, I think it's an interesting thing to analyze today. Again, I'm going to put on my rabbinic hat now to say that I studied a lot in recent years the question of leadership in the text. What is the right leadership according to the Bible and according to religious literature? And it's quite striking to see that all the powerful leaders in our text, none of them is the alpha male. All of them, like Abraham, Isaac, Jacob, Moses, and many others, the true leaders, the ones who are chosen to lead the people, are always characters who have to deal with fragility, vulnerability, and a kind of strong handicap in their society. Abraham is barren in a very patriarchal society. He can have no child with Sarah, his wife. Isaac cannot see. He is blind part of his life. And Jacob is, cannot stand straight. He has this kind of, is leaping. And Moses, as it's even worse, Moses is chosen to be God's spokesperson, but the rabbis tell us that he's, how do you say, megamgem, is he has a hard time expressing himself. So it's quite striking that those leaders are not chosen even though they have an handicap. They are chosen because they have this handicap. And actually, what they experienced as vulnerability or lack of control is what gives them the power to be in control and to act and to be true leaders and political actors in the story. And again, I think it should inspire us today.
In the last part of the book, you're getting pretty explicit about contemporary developments. You are criticizing that post-colonial discourses and the idea of critical whiteness has led to a war of a we, and I quote, a war of the excluded, of those who are racially discriminated against, and are now unifying under the identitarian magic formula against those of guilty Western societies. End of quote. I'm wondering, why can't Jews be included in this we of the excluded?
Well, first of all, what is complex in what I try to explain is that I think we are lucky and blessed to live in a society where people who had no voice have today a voice. And I think we're all aware that it's a true blessing. More and more often we can hear voices of people who have been shut down in a way. And it's a wonderful phenomenon, and we should be happy about it and celebrate this. The problem is that sometimes it leads us to another unlockment in a collective. Like, the idea that today we are witnessing so often opposition and conflict between voices of people who are unable to speak in the first person singular, but immediately have on their shoulder or pretend to carry a first person plural narrative. People say, we the Muslim, we Black people, we gay people, and sometimes also we the Jews. You know, I keep, you know, in recent years, I don't count how many times in my interviews or people I talked with or interviewed me, they were expecting me to be the voice of the Jews, you know, as if it was such a thing of being able to represent and speak in the name of a global we, the Jews, as if the Jews were voting the same way, eating the same way, had the same relationship to Israel or whatever, you know. So I think it's very important today to dismantle something of a monolithic presentation of identities that it's sometimes in place. And you know, in a way, I feel that it's very relevant in France, I would say, particularly because France always had in its history, I mean, the French Republican promise from the beginning was the promise that people would be able to speak in the first person singular and would somehow get rid of their collective belongings, ethnics or religious, that would prevent them from being free citizens in the society. And today there is clearly, and we hear it strongly in France, a kind of conflict of collective narratives in the society. People, even when they say I, very often they mean we. And I think we need to be really concerned that I think when people say we, there is always a form of violence in the background, because every time you use the we, you can be pretty sure that you're muting the voice of minorities inside your own groups. So that's what we should be careful about, I think.
You're speaking of the convergence of two fights today. The right-wing nationalism, on the one hand, that is excluding Jews because of racial thinking, and left-wing intersectionalism that is identifying Jews with the privileged white class. Both movements thrive for authenticity, whereas Jewish identity is based on difference, both within oneself and with the other. Do you think that is the reason why anti-Semitism is on the rise?
I think there are always multiple reasons, you know, why anti-Semitism is on the rise. But I think what we witness today that is special maybe to our time or strong in our era is that we witness alliances between people we never expected to find common grounds with one another. We witnessed weird alliances between extreme right and fundamentalist religious and part of the ultra left all over the world. And I think we never expected those alliances to be so strong. At first sight, we think they have nothing in common, but I think we need to be able to analyze what they do share in their rhetorics. And one of these elements that they share is the one you just mentioned, is the obsession with authenticity. You know, we know pretty well the very old obsession with authenticity and purity that stands at the extreme right discourse all along history and all over the world. The idea that the stranger is contaminating you, that you need to be cautious of what might contaminate your world, something that comes from outside and prevents you to be authentically you or faithful to your history. But suddenly we witness the same discourse coming from other worlds, like obviously coming from fundamentalism, because at the core of religious fundamentalism is the idea that to be truly yourself, you need to go back to the foundation. That's the word fundamentalism, the idea that you are pure and your encounter with modernity, with Western world, with the women, with whatever idea, emancipation, prevented you from being pure, you know, somehow it contaminated your world. And you find sometimes the same obsession with authenticity in the extreme left, in those movements, identitarian leftist movements, who are convinced that there is an indigenous identity that has been polluted by Western world or by whiteness, and we need to reclaim an authentic origin. You know, each time your narrative is about purity of origin, I think it's dangerous for Jews, because Judaism is always about, we go back to the story of Abram, about the idea that your identity is not the purity of your origin. It's exactly the opposite. Your identity has to do with the fact that your origin wasn't pure. Your origin was somehow idolatrous, if I want to use a rabbinic word, but you managed to journey out of this identity, taking with you part of it, but making something out of it. But let me be clear, I think that this obsession with authenticity and purity is also inside the Jewish world today. We're not exempted in the Jewish world from this phenomenon. I hear it constantly, see it around me, like so many people are convinced that they know exactly what it means to be purely Jewish. And I think the very sentence of this Jewish purity is an absolute negation of what the rabbinic teachings brings us. It's, each time we deal with purity in the way we understand it in our society, we are in trouble.
I would like to come to the last pages of your book, and that's the book where there is an I, where you speak about yourself. And my last question for you is it possible to define oneself as non-identically and non-authentically Jewish without giving anti-Semites the power to perceive this definition as deficient?
I think that unfortunately, whatever we might do or not do, say or might say, anti-Semitism will, find way to nourish itself from one discourse or from the opposite one. What I want to say by this is that we should never articulate our position simply by taking into account that it might help the anti-Semitic discourse, because as we know, anti-Semitism is able to accuse Jews of one thing and the opposite. Along history, Jews have been accused of being too rich and too poor, of leading the system or being parasites to the system, of being too rebellious or being too Bolshevik or a capitalist, and today, in a very interesting way, they're perceived as being a minority, but also being dominant, as you said earlier. You can always hear one thing and the opposite. So I think, undoubtedly, when we define our identity as being non-identical, this argument could be used by anti-Semites. But at the same time, I think the question shouldn't be that one. The question should be, how do we help others and everyone in our human experience of fragility and vulnerability? How do we help others and teach others and show others how each one of us can be able to live with mourning and loss and brokenness and infinite identity? And how this consciousness, human consciousness, not Jewish consciousness, is able to help us to prevent anti-Semitism, but not only anti-Semitism, how it's able to prevent us from other tragedies of finite and deadly definitions of ourselves. We are stepping into the unknown now. We don't know what the world tomorrow would be like. All of us have a very strong consciousness that something is ending, something is starting, but we need to be able to take the best from yesterday's teaching into this new world. I don't know if it's the case in Germany, but in recent weeks in France, I'm surrounded by people in this moment of confinement who keep exchanging recipes from their grandmas. People cook recipes from their family. They want to hear or read books that were written by their great uncles during the war. We keep talking about a new world, about the fact that we are leaving an old world and stepping into the new and the unknown. But at the same time, it's as if unconsciously or consciously, we are very aware of how much we need to take the teachings and the wisdoms of yesterday with us in this broken world to be able to create something new out of where we were born, just like Abram, and on our way to a promised land, that has no name, just like in the text.
Well, thank you so much, Madame le Rabbin.
Thank you so much for this invitation. I hope I'll be able to come for real to Germany very soon.
I'm looking forward to that a lot. And I'm giving now the last words, the last passages of your book where you speak about yourself, and my colleague Sarah Fischer will read that to you.
Der andere in uns. Ich glaube nicht, dass mein Judentum erschöpfend durch das definiert wird, was der Antisemitismus aus ihm gemacht hat. Ich glaube nicht nur deshalb, Jüdin zu sein, weil die anderen mir diese Eigenschaft zuschreiben. Aber wenn ich darlegen müsste, worin das authentische Wesen meines Judentums besteht, seine spezifische Besonderheit, der harte, von aller historischen Kontingenz befreite Kern, käme ich in Schwierigkeiten. Und womöglich ist genau dieses Unsagbare die beste Definition, die ich zu geben vermag. Eine authentische, unmögliche Umschreibung des Jude- und Ich-Selbstseins. Zur Definition des Jüdischseins befragt, antwortet Jacques Derrida: Nun, ich weiß, dass ich es nicht weiß, und ich verdächtige alle, die es zu wissen meinen, es nicht zu wissen. Was geht vor? Was geschieht mit mir? Um welches Ereignis handelt es sich, wenn ich auf die Bezeichnung eingehe und mich unbedingt als Jude präsentieren möchte, wenn ich für mich selbst und vor allen anderen sage, ich bin Jude, weder authentisch, noch nicht authentisch, noch quasi authentisch? Oder an anderer Stelle, wenn man zu wissen glaubt, was jüdisch sein bedeutet, kann man sicher sein, dass es schon nicht mehr existiert, ja, dass es nie existiert hat. Endlich sind wir soweit. Darauf mag der Antisemit ungeduldig gewartet haben, falls er dieses Buch wirklich bis zur letzten Seite gelesen hat. Wie lässt sich mit den Juden aufräumen? Hier also die gute Neuigkeit: Es gibt tatsächlich ein Mittel, ihn verschwinden zu lassen. Man muss dem Juden nur einreden, dass er genau weiß, worin sein Jüdischsein besteht. Dann ist es ein für alle Mal vorbei mit ihm. Bis dahin, fürchte ich, muss der Antisemit sich mit ihm arrangieren.
Liebe Zuschauerinnen und Zuschauer, liebe Freundinnen und Freunde des Jüdischen Museums, ich freue mich, dass Sie uns bis hierhin zugehört haben. Ich wünsche Ihnen noch einen schönen Abend und alles Gute. Bleiben Sie gesund.